everybody. Good morning. My name is Jacob. I'm the coordinator here at the Presidio, and it is my honor to present to you Alex Pierre with this conversation of the first revolution in Mexico. So everybody, round of applause please for Alex.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to Jacob. Thank you to the amazing host here at the Tubac State Historic Presidio Park. What a wonderful place. I love giving talks here because we're in a historic adobe building, one of the oldest schoolhouses in the territory, the state. I wanted to ask first, before we got started, who got the party started already? You know, a little mezcal or tequila in your coffee this morning? You got it? You started back there? Burnt's already good to go. He's No tequila. Medicina, yeah, it'll help with the sore throat. So, awesome. Well, my name's Alex Pierre, and my wife and I, we founded this organization, Borderlandia, a few years ago. We're a binational organization. She's my better half, so she's from the fun side of the border. But we're just a binational organization committed to building public understanding of the borderlands. That's our mission, our fundamental mission. You guys probably read the description of this talk. It's the history that we weren't taught in school, right? I mean, we barely are taught the American Revolution in our own country, but this is something that we're never really taught. And for me, it's really a critical point in understanding our neighbor, right? Because if we think about the revolution, our revolution, think about how much that is a part of American identity, right? You know, you think about, the Liberty Bell, you think about Declaration of Independence, you think about later the product of the revolution, which was the Constitution in 1787. So a lot of what we think of ourselves of being American, it stems from those original principles and ideas. And so for us to understand our neighbor, we really need to start with this story, right? And the interesting thing here is the reason why I specifically put first revolution is because in Mexico, they spill blood twice, right? It's not like us where we just spilled blood once in one revolution. Of course, we had the Civil War. But Mexico has been fighting for social justice for pretty much the last 2 or 3 centuries, okay? It's part of the reason why it's forbidden in Mexico today to own your own personal firearm. It's because so much blood has been shed there through the wars, right? So we'll talk about this one that started off first. Look at this beautiful image. This is actually the first Mexican flag right here. It's called the Trigarante flag. Trigarante is short for 3 guarantees. Tres garantías. And that was the fundamental idea that pretty much crystallized the revolution. 3 guarantees that we're going to talk about, okay, a little bit later here. I like to kind of spin these lectures to make it most fun and interesting for you guys, so it's not just me talking at you. And I thought that the most clever and fun way to tell this story is using something that Mexico has used for centuries in really an educational way. And that's been its public art. Going back to the Aztecs, going back to even, just step into San Javier del Bac mission right here. What do you have projected on the walls? You have the story of the Christian faith pretty much depicted. Why? Because of if you go back into the history, a lot of the parishioners, a lot of the indigenous, they weren't literate, right? So how do you convey the story to an illiterate populace, right? Through images, through story. And the same thing happened after the Second Mexican Revolution, right? After the revolutionaries won the war, they had to construct a new national narrative, right? Who here has heard of Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera, right? Almost all of you. But do you know that they were actually contracted by the Mexican government? A guy named Jose Vasconcelos, he actually the guy just grew up right out here in Sasabe. His father was a Mexican customs agent, but he later became the culture minister for Mexico after it won its revolution. So he was the guy who hired people like the great muralists like Frida and Diego. This one in particular is, the last name doesn't certainly sound Hispanic, Juan O'Gorman. But if you guys know who founded Tucson, it was a guy named Hugh O'Connor in 1775. They Hispanicized his name to Hugo O'Connor. But his men knew him as El Capitán Colorado, the red captain, because of his red hair, right? I mean, pretty striking, right? So there's always been this Irish presence in Mexico, and Juan O'Gorman is one of them. And the reason for this Irish presence is basically because, you know, Ireland was under a colonial empire, right? The English, the Protestant English, they had their thumb over Ireland. So a lot of the sons of Ireland, they offered their services to the enemies of England, right? The Spanish Catholic monarchs. And so that's why you had all these wild geese end up in the colonies. Like you go down to Chile, you hear O'Higgins, the name O'Higgins. So here you have O'Gorman, Juan O'Gorman. If you guys have heard of the UNAM University, that beautiful main university, that huge mural, also by Juan O'Gorman. This mural here, this beautiful kind of elliptical mural is in the Castillo de Chapultepec, which is the main history museum in Mexico City. It's where we visit on the tour. It's a fabulous place. And so through this presentation today, I'm gonna be kind of going through the mural to really kind of tell you the story of the first revolution, the War of Independence. There was a little piece missing in that picture. It's the far right-hand side, so I wanted to make sure I included it because this is the end, right? This is the consummation of the independence of Mexico, and you have the flag, and you can see just barely there. You could see that same crest of the eagle perched on the cactus with the snake in its mouth. That is the escudo, or the crest of Mexico. It's where, of course, in the kind of the origin stories of the Aztecs, Teotihuacan, that's how they identified the place where they were going to build their city in the middle of the lake, right? Okay, so that's the national symbol. And there you could see it. This flag is pretty different, though. Is there anything that you guys notice about this flag that's different from the modern one?
No serpent?
Yeah, you're right on a no serpent. What else?
Colors?
The colors, yeah. It's
Crown.
the crown, right? And we're going to talk about the bloody crown pretty soon, too. That's not on the current one. But this outline, to keep it real simple, it's the rule of three, right? So we're going to talk about context, war, and independence. And we're going to break down context to geography. We're going to break it down to talking about New Spain, today's Mexico in the Southwest. And we're going to talk about the story, what's going on back in Europe. And then we're going to hit the war. We're going to talk about the beginning, the main figures, kind of the intrigue at the end, and then finally the consummation of independence. We'll talk about the first Mexican empire, for which this was the flag, an empire, instability, and foreign invasions. This is how we're going to end up the story, okay? So this is Mexico. This is a different Mexico than we know today, right? Thanks to the good old Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and our President James Polk, who ran on his platform was he was going to only serve one term, and he was going to consummate manifest destiny, right? He put some soldiers down in this contested land down by Texas, in between the Rio Nueces and Rio Grande, and that's how they lit the fire for the war, basically. And that's how Mexico lost so much of its national territory. But to set the stage, of course, we're going back 1500s to the Spanish conquest. That's when they arrive. It's almost 300 years that it's a colony. In 1810, the spark that sets off the revolution is known as the Grito, or the Call of Dolores. We're going to talk about that. And then finally, it takes almost 11 years to consummate the independence. Think about that. The war in the U.S. started Lexington Concord 1775 and pretty much ended in 1781 with the Battle of Yorktown. So the war in Mexico, the Independence War, was almost double the time of the American independence. Something to think about too. And then you have the short-lived Mexican Empire, for which we saw the flag, the Battle of the Alamo. It's interesting to read that story from the perspective of the Mexican textbooks compared to the Texas textbooks. There's actually a book that's devoted to that. There's a history book, that examines, how does Cuba interpret Bay of Pigs versus how does the U.S. interpret Bay of Pigs. So very interesting. The famous Pastry War was the first French invasion, and then later the first American invasion with the Mexican-American War. So where was it fought? So all these different colors, you can see it was mainly in central Mexico. It wasn't up here in our area. The reason why it wasn't up here in our area is because this was the conservative stronghold. Why was a conservative stronghold up here in Sonora? Because this is where all the professional soldiers for Spain were fighting the Apaches, right? I mean, look at today. In the U.S. military, it's more right-leaning than it is left-leaning. Same thing in the past, right? So a lot of the soldiers here at the Tubac Presidio, at the Tucson Presidio, they weren't fighting on behalf of Mexico. They were fighting on behalf of Spain, the royalist cause, okay? And what was the first banner that they lift up? It wasn't the Stars and Stripes. It was a very religious banner, right? It was the banner of the Virgin of Guadalupe. I don't know if you guys have heard this story, but it's the first apparition of Mary in the New World. It appeared before an Aztec Indian in the 1520s, Juan Diego. Of course, when he reported this story to the religious authorities, they're like, oh man, this Indian, he's just telling these stories, right? Making up these stories. And so he went back to the shrine of Tunatzin, the female deity of the Aztecs, where he again sees the apparition of Mary. This time, the Mary gives him a cloth, a tilde, which was the traditional cape of the Aztecs. And she says to him, present this cloth before the authorities and they'll believe you. And sure enough, it was the middle of winter. He goes before the bishop, and they're like, "Oh God, this guy again," you know. But this time, it's he opens the cloth, and it's middle of winter. Dozens of roses fall out, and there is this image, that image that you see, which is a source of devotion for thousands of people to this day in Mexico City, pilgrims. As well. And so we'll talk a little bit about her later, but I want to keep it going. So setting the stage for New Spain. You got to understand New Spain to understand why the war happened. This is the richest of all the colonies of Spain, right? We're talking Peru, we're talking Chile, we're talking Venezuela. This is the richest one, so one of the most important for Spain. It's ruled by viceroys. This is another important key. We have 13 colonies, right? The 13 colonies is the root of our federal system, right? I mean, you had a bunch of debtors in Georgia, you had a bunch of Dutch in New York, you had you had the Pilgrims up in Massachusetts. You had a lot of distinct people that didn't get along, and that's why we have the federal system that we have today. In contrast, Mexico, it was one main guy. He ran everything. The viceroy, or literally the viceroy is king, the vice king, the representative of the king. If you look at the Mexican president today, look at all the pomp and circumstance. Look at the big, beautiful chair, the gilded chair he has. That's rooted in this central figure of the viceroy, okay? The economy was an extractive economy. We want to know why Mexico isn't, an economy like the U.S. economy today. It's because it was a very different economy. It was based on extraction. Get the silver out, send it to Spain, right? Whereas in the U.S. colonies, there wasn't a lot of mineral wealth, right? So people had to build businesses and stuff like that. That set us up for a different economy that we have now. So that's, again, why Mexico is different than the U.S. today, okay? Another thing that you had is a stratified racial hierarchy, okay? You may have heard of the casta system. You may have seen those really fascinating paintings that show, the different combinations, genetic combinations. This is rooted in the fact that of all of the countries, the European colonial powers, who was the most multicultural? It was Spain, right? If you've been to Spain, maybe you've been to Toledo. We talk about the three cultures, right? The Jews, the Muslims, and the Christians, right? So they had, this complex blood laws because of the reconquest in Spain. Did you have Moorish blood? Did you have Jewish blood? This system was brought with them. It wasn't just invented when they arrived in Mexico, okay? So that's another important point for you guys to remember, okay? And then you got the French kings in the 18th century. There was a famous war called the War of Spanish Succession. The Brits and the Germans, they didn't want a French king going to the Spanish crown because it would upset the balance of power in Europe, right? But the Bourbons came in, and when the Bourbons came in, they were interested in maximizing the profits in the colonies, right? So they really wanted to wring the people for whatever they could. So this is important to remember and to the lead up to of a revolution, right? This is a great quote from one of the viceroys in 1723. "The world's trade flourishes at the expense of the peoples of America and their immense labors, but the riches they draw from the bosom of the fertile earth are not retained." So that's kind of the idea right there for you. And so here you can see that part of the mural, kind of the depiction of the colonial era here by Juan O'Gorman. You really have to see this in life to appreciate it. And so this is the breakdown, right? They call them the top of the, maybe the 1%ers that we call them today, the Peninsulares, right? The Peninsulares comes from Iberian Peninsula. That's where it comes from, right? The guys that were born in Spain, they're the creme de la creme. The criollos are the next step down, right? They're the people born of European parentage, but born in the Americas. They had some bizarre thoughts in Europe at the time. The Enlightenment hasn't quite hit. They thought that the air wasn't as good as in Europe, that somehow, that they were lesser than the Europeans. And so you had the criollos, and then you had the mestizos, right? This, if you've ever been to Canada, you may have heard of the Métis people, the Métis. They are the, French with the indigenous. And in Mexico, the mestizos, the Spanish with the indigenous, then you have the Indios and the Negros. But let me tell you, this system was very fluid, and it had to do with money. And so if you look at the old archives and you're going through the old records, you see through history, people starting off as Indios and then ending up as criollos too. So this was very fluid, depending on your circumstances in life and all of that, okay? There's going to be a building that a very important building that's actually depicted in the back here that I'm going to talk about a little bit later. So now that we talked about Mexico, what was happening back in Spain? This is very important to understanding how different the independence movement was in Mexico compared to the U.S. Fernando VII becomes king in 1808, but the Napoleonic Wars are going on, right, in Spain. And so Napoleon's brother, Joseph, he's placed on head, and there's no legitimate government in the eyes of the Spanish in Spain. And so all of the people in Mexico are like, we don't want to listen to the Napoleon, so they're like, oh, well, we might as well start our own political societies here. And so there's this instability, there's no top of the food chain telling people what to do in the colonies. And so this is kind of what helps build, this instability is what helps build the revolution. The other important thing is the Constitution of 1812. It was really one of Europe's first liberal constitutions. It recognized the people in colonies as citizens of Spain and granted them full rights. And so the royalist forces, they're like looking back, they're fighting on behalf of the king in Mexico, and they're looking back to their country in Spain, and they're like, these people are getting too liberal for us. So maybe this independence plan is something we might want to buy into. That's a very important point, okay? This is the George Washington figure, okay? This is Washington in Mexico, Miguel Hidalgo. And what's fascinating about him is he's a priest. And so we see the religious kind of connections with this revolution. We talked about the Virgin. He was the parish priest of Dolores. How many of you guys have been to Guanajuato? Maybe San Miguel de Allende? Most of you guys. So it's very close to there. You can visit Dolores. You can see where he gave his grito, the call, the battle cry for freedom. He was educated by the Jesuits, which if you know the Jesuits, they kind of don't like to listen to authority. They just listen to the Pope only. And he was actually investigated by the Inquisition. There's even stories that he may have had children. So it's kind of an interesting guy. I think he would probably work well in one of the telenovelas of Mexico today, and he's one of these guys that started to belong to these secret societies. Figures like Allende, Aldama, Josefa Ortiz de Dominguez. If that Allende sounds familiar, it's because it's San Miguel de Allende. It's named after one of the Spanish officers that put his lot for the Mexican cause. Miguel Hidalgo asked him to help, and he decided that the independence movement was for his. So if you ever go to San Miguel de Allende, one of the coolest spots is his house there. He's got a beautiful stone museum house on the corner there. Definitely go and see that. This is a beautiful mural in the Palace of the Governors in Jalisco, in Guadalajara. Fantastic mural. This was Jose Clemente Orozco, another big name in Mexico for the muralist tradition. My children, will you free yourselves? That's basically what he said when in the pre-dawn hours, when he rang the bell calling for the independence of Mexico. And so his main things that he stressed was the end of Spanish confiscation of the lands and the end to the tribute payments as well. He also called for the abolishment of slavery, which would be consummated much earlier than in the United States. And his rallying cry was "Viva Guadalupe," and the response to the crowd was "Death to the Peninsulares." So let's take a look at these people that were saying "Death to Peninsulares." What do these people look like? You're free to shout it out or raise your hand. These are the 95%ers, right? This is the Mexican pueblo. These are the mestizos. These are the indios. These are the negros. These are also the criollos, the creoles, that also felt that they were, this is their land, and the Spaniards are the ones, controlling everything. So they also cast their lot. Hidalgo had a point where he could even have taken Mexico City, but he was fearful that this huge uncontrollable mob was just going to do devastation. And so he decided not to go and take Mexico City. And so some people think that the war could have been over within a year had he had made the decision, but he didn't. So the very, Lexington Concord of Mexico is, if you've been in Guanajuato, it's the big battle of the Alhóndiga de Granitas. Alhóndiga, it's one of those Arabic words in Spanish. 1 out of every 10 words in Spanish is Arabic in origin from that 700 years of the Moors in Spain. Alhóndiga is basically a granary. If you go to Segovia, they have the old medieval ones. It was kind of a central place, for bread riots and stuff that controlled the wheat. They had just finished building this kind of fortress-looking structure when the war breaks out. And so when they hear that the mobs are coming, all the Spanish Peninsulares, they basically hold up into this building. It's kind of like an impregnable fortress. They're laying sieging to it, and they're not getting any headway. But if you can barely make out here, you can see barely this stone piece on the back of this guy. This is a famous figure. He's the one that breaks the battle. He's known as El Pipila. He was a very strong miner. And apparently how he was able to turn the tide of this battle is he put a huge slab of stone on his back. And so all the musket shots and all the rocks that they were throwing from the sides of the parapets of this building didn't affect him. So he was able to get up to the door and light the door on fire. Once the door was on fire, you can imagine the stream of people went in there and the matanza, the massacre that took place. And so this is kind of when, Hidalgo's fearful of, unleashing these people in Mexico City too. So there he is, Pipila. And that's when I visited back in 2017. It's an extraordinary site. It's a fantastic museum too. And they've got a monument down in there of all the heroes. He didn't live very long. This is another kind of a thing that sticks with the revolution in Mexico is that they were killed. A lot of the rebel leaders were killed. He's basically fleeing to the north, and he gets apprehended, and he's sent to Chihuahua City, the capital of Nueva Vizcaya, as it was called then, for execution and beheading. And this is actually images from when we went on our Chihuahua tour to Chihuahua City. And actually, where the palace of the government, where basically the governor resides, is the spot where they killed Miguel Hidalgo. After they killed him, they cut off his head, and they put it on pikes on the Alhóndiga as a warning for anybody to keep up the rebel cause. And so, with Hidalgo's murder, his execution, the rebel cause didn't lose. It kind of went into the mountains. They kind of adopted more of a guerrilla techniques. And the guy who takes up the baton is Jose Maria Morelos y Pavon. If you've ever picked up the 50 peso note in Mexico, that's the guy on there. Guess what? He's a priest too. So the priests just can't control themselves. They're fighting for independence. They draft the Constitution that really kind of starts to solidify with their principles. And it was a pretty liberal document for the time, abolishing slavery and the caste systems and establishing a republic form of government. However, the Royalist forces, they crushed the guerrilla movement. He's killed again in 1815. But if you've ever been to Michoacan, the capital of Michoacan, Morelia, is named after Morelos. Its original name was Valladolid, which is a city in Spain. And so, in the Spanish colonial times, they named everything after saints, like San Diego, San Francisco. And then after the Spain gets out, they name it after the national heroes. Like one of the rivers here in Sonora is Moctezuma. They're adopting, the Mexican leaders as well. And so you could kind of see that this movement is really in the mountains, all around central Mexico. This is where the battles were basically being fought. So two executions, and we have, luckily, this third guy, the Royal Trinity, rule of three that pulls up, Vicente Guerrero. You know where Acapulco is? It's in Guerrero State, named after him. He was born in that state, very close to Acapulco. He was of African bloodlines, African, indigenous, and Spanish bloodlines. He was really the last major leader at large during the second half of the revolution. He was very successful in his guerrilla campaigns, and he later became the second president of Mexico. He's the one that consummates the abolition of slavery. Very fascinating figure. And you could see mainly his battles were in what later would become the state of Guerrero and Puebla. This is probably the most important figure that we're going to talk about today, Agustin de Iturbide. The last name sounds pretty strange. The reason why it sounds pretty strange is usually these Hispanic last names that sound a little different, like Lizárraga, Vildosola, those are Basque surnames. And if you've ever heard Basque spoken, it sounds nothing like Spanish. It's not like, you can't even compare like the Irish, the English, or the Scottish to the English. It's absolutely nothing. And so a lot of the people who settled in New Spain, and particularly in this area, were Basques as well. And he was also born in what would later become Morelia, Michoacan. And he was actually approached by Hidalgo originally to fight on behalf of the independence, but he said no. But he would be the figure that would later switch sides, basically. With that constitution in 1812 in Mexico, he's like, they're getting a little bit too liberal for us. And back there, and so he sees that this independence, he sees, all of the great things that he could get if he decides to switch sides, basically. And this moment is called the hug of Acatempan, the abrazo de Acatempan. It's in Guerrero. It's where, he's writing letters to Guerrero. Guerrero's like not sure if this is like some ruse, to capture him. Finally, Guerrero meets, and he approaches him with the proposition to join forces and consummate the independence of Mexico. And so the document that comes out of this is basically the Declaration of Independence, if you will. It's the Plan of Iguala. And this is the three guarantees that I mentioned to you about the three garante flag, the three guarantee flag. This is the three central tenets that they agreed to. Interestingly enough, number one, the primacy of Roman Catholic religion. Very different from the separation of church and state in our country. Number two, the absolute political independence of Mexico. And number three, full social equality for all the social and ethnic groups. So in other words, religion, independence, and unity. Religión, independencia, y unión. Those were the rallying calls for the Plan of Iguala. And, the viceroy at the time, guess what his surname was? O'Donoghue. He sees the writing on the wall. He's like, okay, the royalist forces are going over. And so he finally meets with these forces, the two, and he consummates the independence with the Treaty of Cordoba in the Veracruz state. This is the meeting depicted in a painting between them. But Spain refuses. Spain says, O'Donoghue acted on his own. They never formally recognized independence, unfortunately. But this is the culminating moment when the army of the three guarantees marches into Mexico City. If you've ever been on the pedestrian street, Calle Madero, where the famous Sanborn's department store is in Mexico City, this is that same street, which they rode into to the Zócalo, the main plaza, consummating the independence of Mexico on September 27th, 1821. And so in Mexico, they call this Mes Patria, Fiestas Patrias. They call it the month, patriotic month in Mexico, because the month, the date that Grito de Dolores was September, the stroke of, September 16th, the midnight. And then also when he rode in, Iturbide rides in with Guerrero, is also in September as well. And so here's the big celebrations of the Zocalo. You see the cathedral in the background. To the right, you can see the Viceroy's Palace. That's where the Mexican president is, where if you watch his morning news in the morning, he's always there. And this is his palace on Calle Madero. We actually visit there on our tour, where he is the proclamation of him as the first emperor of Mexico. This is quite different from us electing a president with the republic democratic system, because you have to realize, that was a compromise among all the 13 colonies, right? Here in Mexico, their only, notion of government was a viceroy, right? And so that's why they decide to elect an emperor, a Mexican emperor, the central autocratic figure as Iturbide. And so here you can see him in the very, royal regalia. Spain refuses to recognize the legitimacy of Mexico. They even invade Tampico, which is just south of Texas there in 1829. Mexico was devastated by that 10-year, 11-year war with bankruptcy. So he starts to upset the 1%ers in Mexico by taxing them to make up the money. He was very lavish and impulsive. And so people start to not like him. He actually abdicates and has to flee to Europe. He's trying to make his case in Europe, and he actually comes back believing that he's going to be recognized with big open arms, but no, they get him, they capture him, and they kill him, actually. This is actually the blood-stained letter in the Library of Congress. I found this in the Library of Congress that was actually in his vest that was to the people of Mexico when they executed him in 1824, actually. So it was very different revolution than our revolution. In fact, Mexico would go on to have somewhere between a dozen and 20 governments up until the 1860s. So there was a big period of instability. There was still this conservative versus liberal that was rooted in that hug. You had very opposite polar ends politically uniting. And so eventually you'd get the French occupation in Mexico, Maximilian, which was really a civil war in Mexico as well, with the conservatives and the liberals too. The French monarchy helped the conservatives in Mexico. So it all came out of this. So if you guys are excited about all this history and you want to join us this weekend, I think we have a couple spaces left. We're going down to Banamichi, and they have just the most fun parade in the whole world there. The kids make floats, and they dress up like the figures. They even see, Miguel Hidalgo's head on a pike. It's a lot of fun. I don't know if you guys read Linda Ronstadt's new book. Her grandfather was born in Banamichi, and feels like home. This place figures prominently. If you guys want a refreshing after a Sonoran summer, come out to see the water of the Sea of Cortez and see the UNESCO Biosphere Reserve of Pinacate. Want to extend a cordial invitation to this special tour that we're collaborating with CEDO, the wonderful nonprofit out of Rocky Point that's dedicated to taking care of the Sea of Cortez. And we've got some fun day trips. Magdalena de Aquino, they've got some fantastic murals. So if the Mexican muralist tradition is your thing, you definitely want to come to Magdalena de Aquino, which is just 60 miles south of the border. Makes a perfect little day stop. This is a new tour that you guys are the first to hear about. Cananea is actually where the second revolution started. The 1910 revolution, there was a famous mining strike there in 1906. So we'll be talking about that history. We've got amazing Mexican Revolution history right in our backyard here. In Alamos, probably my favorite city in all of Mexico. It's set in the dry tropics. That's where the Sonoran Desert meets the subhumid tropical south. I know the name sounds like an oxymoron, right? Dry and tropics, but it's a fascinating landscape. I mean, think about these. Plants that are semi-desertic, semi-tropical, and in the midst of that, you have this colonial silver city from the 17th century. It's a magical town. Want to invite you there too. That's going to be for Day of the Dead, actually. They have one of the oldest cemeteries in the state of Sonora. And it's interesting. It's kind of like in a New Orleans fashion. All of the graves are above ground there too. So that's where we'll be for that tour. And if food is your thing, for me, that's always the first bridge to getting to know a new culture. Check out this. Bacanora, the denomination of origin. Mr. John O'Rourke here, he's been on the inaugural one, so you can listen to him if he remembers anything from that one. But it's a lot of fun. We get to meet the distillers up in the Sierra Madres. Just wonderful people, so hospitable. They'll give you your shirt off the back of their back. And then we've got the new Hermosillo culinary tour. I mean, Hermosillo for me is just a culinary destination. I mean, things that you would get in New York City for like $100 a dish, you can get there for like $5, you know, like scallops and the best carne asada in all of Mexico, the best of surf and turf in all of the country. And this is our brand new tour right here, Tubac, Casas Grandes, the other UNESCO site back in our backyard. Fascinating place. And of course, if you love Mexican art, they have the beautiful Mata Ortiz town there. Thank you guys. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know. Thank you very much for your attention this morning. Where did all the Spanish soldiers come from?
Well, I know where they came from.
Yeah.
What happened after Mexico separated from Spain? Did they go back? Did they stay there?
Yeah, a lot of them went back. A lot of the troops that were actually brought in from Spain to fight the war were brought back. A lot of them that were fighting the Royalist forces that were born in Mexico, the Criollos and the Mestizos, a lot of them decided, you know, when the, like here in this case of Sonora, basically there was a rioter that came up here and informed them, you know, you got to lower the Spanish flag and raise the Mexican flag, and so they had to take oaths of allegiance to the new government. So I'd say most of the Spaniards that were brought in went back. Most of the Criollos that fought on behalf of Spanish Royalists, they stayed. Yeah. Great question. Any other questions? No, I must have done a great job. Wait, the test is coming now, so. But we've got some literature up here. Don't be afraid. We produce a digital magazine. If you're not on our digital magazine list, come get on it. It's free. We write about the art, culture, history of the Borderlands. It's a bi-monthly newsletter. So come get on that. And come say hi to me or my wife, okay? Alrighty.